we're seeing that the reading from the market, from economists, is that they sense that more hawkish tone during the decision from last week. Are they reading too much into this, or you're seeing this as the stronger possibility of more rate hikes in the coming months?
Well, thank you for having me here. I would start saying that we don't like labeling the things we do as a hawkish or dovish. I think what our mandate is very clear. We need to have inflation in its target, 3%. We have had a very complicated year in 2017. Inflation has been going up. And in the most recent readings, a second round of some shocks have affected inflation. So I would say that the key driver has been that there has been a gap between inflation latest numbers and the expected path that we had by mid-year.
Some investors, including BlackRock, have criticized the central bank from having this very long cycle of increasing rates. And they are worried about the cost for the economy. What do you tell them, and why do you think it's so necessary?
I think Mexico's economy has had a very unique and peculiar business cycle. It's not only the cyclical conditions that are driving rates. We risk premiums and have been affecting the exchange rate, and we have been facing supply shocks like the increase in gasoline prices. So inflation has been posting very high numbers. And monetary policy has been taking a restrictive stance, basically to cope with that challenge. We understand clearly the cost that this entails, but I think the larger cost it will be if we don't anchor inflation expectations properly, and if we don't have adequate price formation in the economy. Otherwise, the increase in rates would have to be higher.
The inflation target is 3% plus minus 1%. And we know the target is always being reviewed, but do you see any risk of this being changed, the target for next year?
The target has worked very well for Mexico. I think it's very clear. And we have had a long track record of having that target. And I think that is part of our strategy, and that is quite likely to be maintained.
Next year, as we were discussing, is going to be a challenging year. You have NAFTA negotiations. You have also the presidential election in Mexico. And it's hard to say, obviously, if the currency is undervalued or overvalued. But having these factors, plus the approval of a fiscal reform in the U.S., what's the impact that you are expecting on the currency here?
I think you point to a very key question. I think in terms of the exchange rate, there are drivers on fundamentals and the risk premium associated to those fundamentals. And when those risk premiums increase, either because of NAFTA negotiations or other considerations, the exchange rate depreciates. And as soon as those risk factors abate, maybe we can have a different trend on the exchange rate. But that's why we have been of the view that it has been very important to have a tight monetary stance in order to have an orderly adjustment of the economy in these very uncertain circumstances.
Mr. Diaz de Leon, how strong do you feel like you have to follow the increases by the Fed, the potential increases by the Fed here in Mexico?
I think that has created a lot of debate, and that is one of many elements that we follow. And I think it is important also to highlight that interest rate differentials and short-term interest rate differential are important for providing or inducing orderly conditions in the FX market. And that is also important when you have inflation in the levels that we have seen it. As soon as we can have inflation converging in a more clear way towards its trend, I think those are considerations that could be revised. But so far, I think this element has played a crucial role because of this level of inflation.
In that case, do you see a possibility of having an increase in the U.S. that is not exactly followed by another increase here in Mexico?
We have never tried to hint that we will link in any direct way. It is an additional element that we have to consider. We have to consider several factors, and I think the interest rate differential has worked well to try to foster orderly conditions in Mexico's financial markets, and that's how we regard to that. Clearly, there is no automatic connection there.
Now the market is projecting inflation for next year to close the year above 4%. How confident are you that it's going to remain within the target rate of minus 4%?
I think in this case we have to be very clear about how we communicate, how we see things going forward. We see inflation, generally overall CPI inflation, converging towards 3% by the end of next year. Conditional on several things, especially since we're facing so much factors and uncertainty elements, which is orderly condition in financial markets, no additional supply shocks, mainly in the non-core component, and also the absence of pressures from labor markets.
How Mexico should react to lower corporate rates in the U.S.? What are the options that Mexico has realistically that they can apply?
Well, I think there are two variables. One is the dynamics on financial markets, and we have seen in the last days some adjustment in long-term U.S. rates and also in currencies throughout the world. That is one part of the adjustment, and the other one is how to make and to retain FDI flows in Mexico. And I think that is a challenge for also the rest of the world, not only Mexico. And I would say that FDI reacts to several factors, not only to one factor, in this case taxes. So I think we need to be mindful of that and try to improve our competitive mix through various factors.
And what options can Mexico execute to improve that competitiveness?
Well, in terms of direct fiscal policy, that is the Ministry of Finance responsibility, and I'm sure that they are already thinking about this. In the rest of the elements, I think we need to try to make costs and productivity, labor productivity gains more material, which is basically have a stronger skill force and try to improve competitiveness, also improving in security and rule of law. All these are elements that work in these competitiveness formula and will be very helpful to be very attractive to FDI flows.
What about cutting corporate taxes in Mexico? Do you think the next administration, whoever it is, they should have this on the table and ready to send to Congress?
I think that it's probably too early to tell. I think we need to take a full evaluation of the whole competitiveness of the economy and try to work on several fronts. I think this is not one single variable that needs to be matched up, and I think we need to be considering other options and other variables.
We have seen some of the tools that the Mexican Central Bank has used with the Finance Ministry to try to control the volatility on the currency. Do you expect to use different tools or new tools ahead of 2018, given all these factors that you have mentioned that can have an impact on that volatility?
We think that the toolkit that we have at hand, it's a good one. With the latest edition of the non-deliverable forwards that was introduced early this year, we believe that we have a full range of instruments that could be used in case, and this is very important to highlight this, in case we see a reduced in the operation volume and depth in the FX market. We don't want to lean against the wind and lean against a real exchange rate depreciation when that is needed. But we also are mindful to have orderly conditions in the FX market, and that is precisely when and why we have those instruments.
Do you think it may be needed, given all the risks for next year, that the volume of those actions may be increased and more dollars may be offered to the market?
Well, we always, in these Exchange Commission communiques, the last sentence always says, we're keeping our options open, we're keeping a wide range of possibilities, and if things require to do something, we will use the toolkit, but we are not expecting in any particular circumstance or date to be using it.
One final question, and we see around the world a lot of concerns, questions, and even optimism about Bitcoin. Mexico is preparing a fintech law. What do you think is very relevant to the Bitcoin in this law, and what steps are you going to take to make sure everything is done orderly?
I think fintech is a great opportunity to reduce the gap and getting financial services closer to the population. but we need to be mindful of avoiding systemic risk and risks to the consumer. And in terms of cryptocurrencies, I think we need to be very aware of the risk that they entail. Last week, the central bank, together with the Ministry of Finance and the National Banking Commission, we issued a statement basically saying that consumers should be mindful and wary about some of these alternatives. There is a lot of regulatory bodies throughout the world saying similar warnings in these days. So I think it is important to be very cautious and to understand that this is very high risk investment and that things could go sour.